Hello, and thanks for joining us. My name's Ian Stroud.
And my name is David Malone, and this is Hyperland. And on today's Hyperland, we are really excited to be able to talk to Professor Graham Harman. Professor Harman is the Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at SciArc in Los Angeles, and SciArc is, well, without doubt, one of the world's leading schools of architecture. It's always been referred to as tremendously avant-garde. Professor Harman is here to talk to us about his new book called Waves and Stones, subtitle On the Ultimate Nature of Reality. Graham, thanks very much for coming to talk to us this evening.
It's my pleasure.
Now, Ian and I have read the book, and we've obviously talked about it before. And we were quite excited because Ian and I made a series a few years ago called Why Are We Here? And as we were reading the book, we sort of realized, we came to this view that it was as if in that series we had explored this great big mountain of questions. And then in your book, it seemed, I think Ian agrees with this, it seemed like you had been exploring the same mountain, but from the other side.
Yeah.
And therefore sort of approaching it with a different set of terminology, but it seemed like it was the same mountain, looking at this ultimate nature of reality, whether it's waves or stones. Do you agree with that, Ian?
Yeah, no, I do. I mean, we were looking at it more. It was more sort of science and religious terminology, I suppose, going into it. But yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, Graham, they are deep questions, but the feeling that I think both Ian and I got from the book is that you feel very strongly, and certainly the way you seem to have written the book, that these are not questions that are just important to professional philosophers or quantum scientists, but that the way that you see the world, those deep questions, has not just a relevance, but an importance for how we all see our lives. Is that true? Was that part of what you had in mind when you wrote the book?
Yes, and that's why I began with the passage from Nikos Kazantzakis, where Odysseus discusses the three moments in his life that stood out among all others. Because even in looking at our own lives, there's this question of, were there real turning points that changed everything? Whether in our own lives or in historical trajectory of a nation or of a discipline. The difference between the continuous and the discrete is found everywhere. And that's what makes it a philosophical problem. It's not one of these specialized problems that only shows up in certain disciplines. And of course, the conflict between the continuous and the discrete is also there at the center in the last 100 years of physics, this unsolvable or irreconcilable match between quantum theory and general relativity that I think we'll get into, that's really right at the heart of that as well. So it is present as a major paradox in cutting-edge science, philosophy, evolutionary theory, but then it's also there in your everyday life. This question of whether there are turning points or whether there's simply gradual changes over a long period of time.
Yeah, and one of the things which was there in the book, which I sort of wrestled with, was, is there a sense from which when people have historical or political or psychological theories, that they want to say, you should believe my political theory or my psychological theory because it accords with the underlying nature of the reality according to physics. So, if people want to have a discontinuous vision, that there are just specific turning points, that they want to say, well, you should believe this political theory which works this way because ultimately nature at the level of elementary particles, that's how it works. Is there a sense in which people are always trying to ground their historical or political or economic or psychological theories by claiming that it fits with the underlying nature of reality?
I think it's a bad idea to do that because there's all the various fields of knowledge are not that well integrated so that you can use one as the grounding for the others. So if
Yeah.
someone were to say, for example, that quantum field theory teaches us that everything is in constant flux and therefore politics should be based on constant change,
Yeah.
well, I hear things like that. Um,
Don't we all?
there are respectable philosophers who say things like this. And the problem with that is that the constraints are different in the different fields, and the kind of evidence that binds our decisions is different in the different fields. Advanced science is going to change fairly radically every century or so in its views about the ultimate nature of reality.
Yeah.
And this means it would be a mistake. Your philosophy would become very dated, whether it's your political philosophy or anything else, if you were to ground it directly on some supposed finding of science. And so that's simply not how it works. Each discipline has its own constraints and its own guiding evidence. And so it's okay if different parts of human cognition seem to contradict each other at a given time because they're dealing with different kinds of evidence at any given moment.
Yes, but as you say, they do. It does seem like there's a tendency. Well, there's a temptation to have sort of science envy and say, well, if I can show how this fits with what quantum physics is saying, then my political theory must be right. And as
Yes.
you say, people do it.
We've all suffered from about 4 centuries of science envy because this has been a golden era modernity for the exact sciences, both in terms of the tremendous revolutionary discoveries and the practical benefits, and as well as practical threats that have come from this part of human cognition. But it doesn't work for everything. I often talk about aesthetics as an area that is a kind of cognition not based on knowledge, not based on literal ascription of properties to objects. So if you're looking at a great painting, you're not really primarily gaining knowledge from it. You may gain some knowledge peripherally from your experience with Picasso, but that's not primarily what is happening, whereas that's what you expect from the sciences. And that's not just a peripheral example. This also goes right at what philosophy is, because philosophy is philosophia. It's the love of wisdom, not wisdom itself, in what the ancient Greek word means. And Socrates is constantly telling us in Plato's dialogues that he knows nothing. He's never been anyone's teacher.
Yeah.
And this is not just irony. So there have been attempts to make philosophy scientific, but these are not a good idea because philosophy also has the fine arts side. Franz Brentano, the great Austrian philosopher who flourished in the late 1800s, early 1900s, gave a famous lecture in Vienna in 1895, where he pointed out that in one sense, philosophy is like the exact sciences. It makes a certain amount of progress. But on the other hand, it's more like the fine arts. It has periods of ripeness and decadence. Just as we wouldn't necessarily say today that the arts of 2025 is better than the art of the Florentine Renaissance. I think most people would say quite the opposite. There are important artists working today, but I think the overall aesthetic culture of the Florentine Renaissance and a few other periods stands out above what we have now. And so it's not like computer science where we're getting better versions of the iPhone every year, purportedly, because something like philosophy of the arts it's a balancing act involving give and take between many different decisions that are made. It's not something where you can simply quantitatively improve. Say a 100-meter foot race, over time, through training, the racers should be able to get a little bit faster every decade. And perhaps, I don't even think the exact sciences are like that, but they're maybe a little more like that than philosophy or the arts are. And there's also the fact that a lot of human cognition is indirect and purposely indirect. And so if the goal in the sciences or in analytic philosophy, the type of philosophy which is modeled on the exact sciences, are always about being clear, not being fuzzy or muddle-headed, simply saying exactly what you mean and proving something or disproving it decisively, that's not really something you can do in philosophy. As I mentioned in the book, you can't really say that Spinoza, the great Dutch philosopher, proved that God is nature. Okay, that was his view. You could say that, I'm sorry?
Oh, I was just saying yes, but actually providing the evidence for it. You can't.
Right, that's right. And then Carl Friedrich Gauss, the great German mathematician, you can say that he proved the fundamental theorem of algebra because mathematicians are bound by Gauss's results.
Yeah.
Philosophers are not bound by Spinoza's results. So we do not make progress in that way. We do not make progress by proof, by showing that something is definitely true or impossible. That's very rare in philosophy, so rare that I can't even think of a single good example of it at the moment. That even in the most seemingly uncontroversial points, there's always some brilliant philosopher who takes the contrarian position, and not always without reason. And so it's simply human cognition is a fairly diverse ecosystem. It's not one that can be governed by the model of the exact natural sciences or by mathematics or by logic on all fronts. And I think it's very easy to see in the case of the arts. Maybe a little harder to see in the case of philosophy, but I think I can still prove it. And so in this book, I tried to cover a number of different things. I covered physics, mathematics, but I also covered the so-called soft disciplines. I covered some literature, some philosophy, history, and so forth. So,
and obviously on the title, you've got waves and stones. So throughout the book, you are looking at these two fundamentally different ways of saying, well, this is the ultimate nature of reality. You know, the wave being that everything is in flux, and the stone being no, things might look in flux, but that's just the movement of immutable bits that the universe is made of, and ultimately the universe is made of immutable bits. Those, I was you characterize in the book that obviously this stones view is the sort of one we attribute to schoolboy version of science, that it's measurable and definable and it's made of this and not that. And then you suggest that the waves has been a more recent fashion, that there's been a sort of reaction against that. But I did love the fact that you slightly make fun of the
of the
what was it? You
fashionistas.
called it the blendorama. I love that.
Blendorama. Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that, because it's just to get your view of that other view.
All right. Well, one way of looking at the world, of course, is that everything's made of individual chunks, made of individual things. And yes, this is associated with a classical view of the world, and often associated unfairly with a kind of stodgy, middle-aged, mediocre way of looking at the world. So if we take a great philosopher like Aristotle is a philosopher of individual substances. He thinks individual things are the primary stuff of the world. And there are some problems with his vision. He tends to favor natural things over artificial things, whereas we're interested in airplanes and computers and AI devices and things of this sort in our time. But Aristotle is the great classical representative of a philosophy of individual substances, as he called them. Well, then there are more recent philosophies, especially early 20th century onward, who like to reconceive of everything in terms of action and flux and change. And this naturally has a certain contrarian power. Everything's moving all the time. Everything is constantly dynamic and shifting. And this has also taken on a kind of political prestige, because people have somewhat lazily associated the philosophy of things with a conservative politics in which nothing ever changes. Everything is what it is. Everything is self-identical and simply stays the same, whereas somehow change is always the slogan of progressive movements politically. It always has been, right? That we should change the existing power relations. Well, the problem with that is that you can't have everything changing all the time, because, well, first of all, if you did, changes aren't always good. We've had quite a few changes in the last 10 years of American politics that I think are anything but good. And we had this amazing eruption of flux at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, that was anything but progressive or liberating. It involved a number of thugs attacking the United States Capitol at our president's direction. There's nothing liberating about this. I lived through the Egyptian Revolution, and that was actually quite exhilarating. But then they ended up with something worse than what they had before. It's quite a depressing result. They ended up with
Brotherhood,
a more repressive autocracy than they had under Mubarak. Even as wonderful as it was to live through that and the possibility of change, it simply ended up worse. So change itself should not be spoken of triumphalistically as though it's always a good thing. Also, change becomes meaningless if there's not some background of stasis. If everything were constantly melting into different shapes constantly around us, and there were no stability whatsoever, we'd have this kind of kaleidoscopic hallucinatory experience that wouldn't necessarily be liberating or fulfilling in the least. So we need to start with the point that change itself is not something to be admired simply because it's changed. But to get back more to what I think is the main point of your question, there are numerous fields. I would say every field has this. There's usually a debate between two positions, one of which looks at things as moving gradually, and the other of which looks at things as happening in sudden jumps. One of the most famous ones, of course, is the debate in evolutionary theory from the 1970s forward between the Darwinian gradualism of people like Richard Dawkins, who see evolution as happening through a huge number of tiny changes from generation to generation, so that species may evolve over millions or billions of years. And then you've got the contrary theory of people like Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, starting in, I believe it was 1972, their article on punctuated equilibrium, claiming that evolution actually happens fairly quickly in geological terms. That in their case, it might be due to some major environmental change that causes certain species to go extinct very rapidly. For instance, the asteroid that we now believe killed the dinosaurs that struck the Yucatan Peninsula killed off these dinosaurs and left a huge evolutionary space for mammals and birds to enter and to diversify and take over very quickly. And so you'll see a pretty sudden change in the fossil record. In fact, the fossil record does not contain the sort of gradual changes that Darwinian theory would have us expect. So as important as Darwin was as a theorist, there seems to be something wrong about the gradual model of evolution. It seems that evolution can happen pretty quickly. And Eldredge and Gould aren't the only alternative. There's also Lynn Margulis, the American evolutionary theorist, who believes that evolutionary change happens largely through endosymbiosis, as she calls it, where two previously separate species unite into a new one, which by definition is going to happen very suddenly. So if you imagine a virus entering a cell and becoming part of that cell and giving that cell new capacities that it didn't have before. For instance, Margulis thinks that life forms were only able to survive oxygen, which is a very toxic material, because of this kind of endosymbiosis, bringing in a virus or a bacterium from outside that allowed living cells to process oxygen as a good thing rather than as a toxin. And so that's another possible theory for how evolution could happen very suddenly. And this debate's been going on for a while. And then if I could just throw physics into the mix here, because I think it can be explained fairly simply, and I think your audience is at least somewhat scientifically literate because of your own interests. As many people know, for a little over 100 years, physics has been torn between its two great pillars, one of which is quantum theory, based on the idea that nature comes in small chunks, right? That there's a smallest unit of everything. There's a smallest chunk of light called the photon. And that leads to all sorts of paradoxes. And then Einstein's general relativity, his theory of gravity, which talks about gravity as a curvature of space and time by mass, which is something that happens gradually. Space and time curve gently due to mass. They don't, in our current understanding, space and time do not come in chunks, although some people suspect they might, but that's not the current state of play. And the problem, of course, is that particles move through space and time. Particles interact with gravity. And so you have this ultimate problem that you have nature as being made of chunks, but that have to interact through something that's not chunky. And this is a problem. And for some reason, the difference between general relativity and quantum theory is often explained as the difference between quantum theory is very good at dealing with very small things and gravity's good at dealing with very large things. And even top flight scientists will say this. Michio Kaku says this in his book, one of the great writers of popular science books, a distinguished physicist in his own right in America. And that's a helpful rule of thumb, but strictly speaking, it's not true, because strictly speaking, quantum effects do also occur at the level of macroscopic objects, and general relativity also works at the small scale. So it's a slight exaggeration. The real way you should describe this tension is the tension between the continuous and the discretes. Maybe I can take this back to ancient Greek thought and make it even simpler to show how long this has been going on. Aristotle himself Aristotle himself wrote a number of great books, but probably his two most important are the Physics and the Metaphysics. The Physics, obviously, is his book about nature. It was the state-of-the-art theory of nature for 1,500 years, until it was improved in the modern times by Galileo, Descartes, and later Newton. Then you've got the Metaphysics, which that name was given to it by an editor. Supposedly, it just meant the book after the physics, but meta in Greek can also mean beyond. So it came to mean what is beyond physics, the deeper philosophical questions that go beyond the physical realm.
Yeah.
But what the real difference is between those books, and I'm not sure this was noticed before I wrote Waves and Stones, is that the physics is all about the continuum and the metaphysics is all about the discretes. So if I can explain the continuum here a little better, continuum is a single undivided stretch of something that contains as many parts as you want it to have. So number is a very simple one. I tell the story in the book that when I was very, very young, I don't know, 3, 4 years old, I asked my mother if it was possible to count to 100. And she said yes, and had me start counting right then and there. And somewhere in the low 70s, I started crying because I hadn't figured out the principle yet, and I thought this was going to go on forever. And 100 is a large number for a small child.
Yeah.
And she said, "Don't worry, we're almost done. We're almost done." And so I got to 100 in tears. But that's a finite number of counting numbers. That's a finite number of integers.
Yeah.
But of course, there's more than 100 numbers between 0 and 100. It's a continuum. You can go by 0.1s. You can go 0.1, 0.2, 0.3.
Yeah.
You can keep counting by smaller and smaller increments. And so if we had counted that way, my crying never would have stopped because we never would have reached 100. There are infinite number of numbers.
Yeah.
So the number line is the best example of a continuum. And Aristotle saw this, that you can cut up any number into any number of pieces you want. That's a continuum.
Yeah.
If someone were to ask how many people are involved in this podcast, however, we can't do it that way. There's exactly 3 people involved in this podcast. We can't say, well, if you look at it one way, we're 5 people, and if you look at it another way, we're a half a person. That's the opposite of a continuum. There are a definite number of people here. You can cut a person into an infinite number of pieces, but then they're dead.
Yeah.
They're no longer a person.
Yeah.
But other examples of continua would be, how long is this podcast? Well, we can say it's a 1-hour podcast, but how many units of time are in this podcast? That's completely arbitrary. We can cut it the way they want. However we want. And so I distinguish in the book between cutting and carving. Cutting is completely up to you. You can cut a thing into as many tiny pieces as you want. Carving is in the phrase carving something at the joints. You have to carve it in just the right way.
Yeah.
There's always an exact number of people in any conversation, or an exact number of people in Los Angeles, even if it's hard to count. And that's the simplest form of the conflict between the continuous and the discrete. Yeah. Something that can be split up infinitely into as many pieces as you want, and something that cannot. And it turns out these are not as easy to reconcile as people think, because again, a continuous thing like space and time is populated by discontinuous things like entities. So humans have to walk through continuous space and time, and so there's a question of how these interact. And then in fields like physics and evolutionary biology, it poses real disciplinary problems. How to account for this?
Yeah, and that's really the heart of your book, is that if the world does have some things which are discrete, like me or you.
Yes, that's right.
In a world which in other aspects is continuous, how do these two very different kinds of entities all exist in the same universe and seemingly interact? And it's also in us, isn't it? Because, when I look at myself, it's easy to say, well, I'm just a different person every morning I wake up from what I was when I went to sleep, and I'm not the same person as I am now at, in my 60s as I was when I was 7.
Right.
But at the same time, I've had philosophers tell me this, and that there's no such thing as me. There's no self. There's no David. They scoff at this notion that there's an intrinsic Davidness to me. And yet I balk at that, because I think, well, yeah, I know I have changed, but I still definitely feel that there's some part of me which was recognizable when I was 7 and is still recognizable.
I agree with the latter. And there's a real debate on this in the history of philosophy. The people who are disagreeing with you are essentially the heirs of David Hume from the 18th century, the great Scottish philosopher, who very forcefully argued that there are no objects, there are just bundles of qualities. So there isn't really such a thing as an apple. When we perceive the world, we just perceive red, round, hard, juicy, cold, sweet. And we experience those things so often together that we associate them together in our mind and give it a nickname, apple. But there's not really something that's an apple over and above qualities. And so, according to that theory, every time a hair falls from your head, you're a different person because you are a sum total of different qualities, and the qualities cannot change at all without you dying and being replaced by something else. This is actually a very strong thread running through British philosophy in general, because even in the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead says something similar, right? There's one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, in my opinion, says that there is simply a close relationship between you and the next instant of time. It's not exactly the same thing. Whereas the other tradition, which begins with Aristotle, is the idea that there's a difference between what he calls substance and accident. So David, the substance, remains the same, and you can go through accidental changes. And then in the 20th century, phenomenology picked up this torch. Edmund Husserl, founder of phenomenology, German philosopher, actually Austrian philosopher, said that an object changes its properties constantly from instant to instant, and yet we never stop thinking of it as the same thing. So if you see a blackbird flying through your garden, it remains the same blackbird no matter what the exact angle of its wings are at any instant. And this is what we perceive first. We perceive the object first. We don't perceive the qualities first, like Hume says. And so this is an interesting philosophical debate that happens. And one of the reasons I side with the latter way of looking at it, Aristotle's and Husserl's instead of Hume's, is that I don't think we really perceive qualities in a disembodied way. I think qualities are always inflected by the object to which they belong. So Maurice Merleau-Ponty, one of the great French phenomenologists of the mid-20th century, who died too young, Merleau-Ponty makes this wonderful point that the black of an ink pen and the black of an executioner's hood, nice example, are not the same black, even if it's the exact same wavelength of light, because the color, how you perceive the color, is influenced by the object to which it belongs. And so we never really perceive qualities in a vacuum. The qualities are holistically defined by the object to which they belong. And so there's also a middle zone. I wrote a book called Immaterialism nine years ago. Subtitle was Objects and Social Theory, where I talk there about the Dutch East India Company. I wanted to do an analysis of a social object, a very special social object, the first corporation in world history that had public stockholders. And what I wanted to look at there was that some people would say the Dutch East India Company was the same thing all the way through. Others would say, like Hume, that it was changing from one instant to the next. And what I found instead from looking at the history of that company is that there were moments that I would call symbioses, along the lines of Lynn Margulis's theory of evolution. Moments when the Dutch East India Company created a symbiosis with another object that led to an irreversible change so that it was no longer the same company as it was previously. And just to give a couple of examples of that, the first was that they they created a position called the director of the Dutch East India Company, which was necessary in those days of slow communication and slow transportation, because obviously the people on the scene in what is now Indonesia could not wait for instructions from Amsterdam months at a time. So this person needed to be empowered to sign treaties and declare war. And so that was the first step, the fact that they created this independent governorship that was partly autonomous from the Dutch government. There were two locations that ended up changing the Dutch East India Company irreversibly. One was in the south, near what is now Jakarta, because it changed the nature of the company. And then later they got one in the north, near what is now Singapore, which tied together the old Chinese and Arab trade routes. Then there was a terrible thing that happened. I believe it was their fourth director, Jan Pietersen Koen, was a really hardcore individual who simply decided that in order for the Dutch nation to be sustainable as an independent nation, they had just declared independence from Spain, the Spanish crown. They needed an immense amount of money at the time to be able to fight with the Spanish, who were a military superpower of the day. And in order to do this, excuse me, Koen saw rather clearly and ruthlessly that our company would have to be a monopoly, complete monopoly. Not only will we have to ruthlessly exclude all other European powers, we would also have to monopolize trade between Asian countries and not allow them to trade with each other, except trading through the Dutch as intermediaries. Now, the Netherlands was already a fairly liberal environment at the time, and people were very uncomfortable with this in Amsterdam. In fact, they concluded a peace with England and agreed to share the profits from the Southeast Asia spice trade with England. And Kern was infuriated by this because he felt he had done all the work to create a Dutch monopoly. And so as he was leaving at the end of his term as governor, he instructed his successor to invite a number of the English officials to dinner and massacre them for the specific purpose of causing a war with England so that the Dutch would not have to give up this monopoly on the spice trade that they had been building up. And this is what happens. A number of English officials were coldly and brutally murdered. And if you go back and look at documents from the time, there were publications in England about this atrocity and how to respond to it. It did change the nature of the company and did largely enrich the company, since the Dutch were able to prevail for a time until England got its act going in what is now India. And England was later able to prevail because of changing tastes in the European market. People in the 18th century lost interest in spice and gained interest in coffee, tea, and chocolate, which England was much better able to provide at that point because of its territories in Yemen and in India. But there was that. And then one last example I want to give of a symbiotic attachment in the case of the company was that around 1650, the Dutch East India Company finally realized they were making more money inside Asia than they were going back and forth to Amsterdam. And so they reconceived themselves as an Asian entity and realized that most of the ports in Asia at the time were on rivers and weren't very deep. And so they would need a different kind of ship than these giant ocean-going ships that circumnavigated South Africa. I guess that's the wrong word, that would go around South Africa back to Europe. And that they would need to focus on these shallower ships designed to go up rivers, which originally were a Chinese specialty. So they began by hijacking these Chinese ships, simply seizing them and using them before eventually designing their own. Anyway, the point being that this shows how certain kinds of objects in a way are in between those. There's a middle ground between remaining the same and changing every instant, which is passing through a series of important changes that I call symbioses, where you have irreversible steps forward, where it was still the same company, but it enters a new phase of its history. And my theory is that this is true of all of our biographies as well, that we all go through, say, a half dozen important changes in our life. These tend to happen relatively early in life, and then we reach mature form as a person or stable form. Occasionally, they can happen later. But mostly this happens maybe, say, by age 30, until we reach our adult selves because of these things occurring as they did. And what's interesting is I don't know the exact title of this study, but I once read about a study done by some anthropologists. They called it the village theory. And this theory involved going to human habitations around the world of many different sizes, from tribal villages to megacities. And they found, strangely enough, that most people, effectively almost all people around the world, no matter what size of society they're living in, have about the same number of important experiences. So most people will have around the world have one or two important friends who change them, one or two important loves, one or two important experiences in their life. It seems that the human mind simply doesn't have more room than that for life-changing experiences, no matter whether you're in Shanghai or New York City or London, or whether you're in a village in the Amazon. Your brain has a certain number of slots that allow you to change radically. And I think this is what the symbioses are that I spoke about in that book. And these are, of course, discontinuous changes. They're not gradual. We also have gradual changes in our lives, but there are undeniably discontinuous ones, such as getting married, right? One day you're not married, the next day you're married. And there are certain expectations and lifestyle changes that happen as a result of that. It's a very good example of a discontinuous change, or the birth of a child.
Yeah. I mean, in your book, you characterize, you say that there is the radical view that everything is flux, and then there's the radical view that no, everything is discrete. Yes. And then you bring up, I was so excited when I read it in the book. You bring up Henri Bergson,
yes,
the great French philosopher, who I read decades ago at university, and then quickly realized that I was the only person reading him because he was tremendously out of fashion. And when I did mention it to people, my professors, they frowned at me as if they'd caught me reading something only slightly distasteful. Why have you come back to Bergson? Because I found him fascinating, but there's no denying it that you and I and a few other people must be a very small minority. And I thought, wow, why has Graham gone for Bergson? Because he was as famous in his time as Einstein, wasn't he? And then nobody knows him now. What happened, and why have you gone back to him?
All right. Well, I should first say that the credit for reviving Bergson, a lot of it should go to Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher who died in 1995, who was a lifelong admirer of Bergson. And Deleuze started becoming very popular in the Anglophone world in the 1990s and still is. And so I think he deserves a lot of the credit for that revival. You talked about how he fell completely out of fashion. Yes, in the early 20th century, he was the world's most famous philosopher. There's some amazing stories about him. He was particularly popular with the upper classes in various countries, and with the sorts of people we might call New Age now, spiritually inclined people. That was his clientele. We should first say that he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. One of very few philosophers. I can think of only two philosophers, Bergson and Bertrand Russell, are the only two philosophers I can think of at the moment who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. And it's ironic that Bergson's brother-in-law was Marcel Proust, great novelist, who never won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Bergson's wife was actually not brother-in-law. Bergson's wife was Proust's cousin, not brother, I should say. But Bergson is a masterful stylist, and that's one reason to read him. He is sometimes discredited because he does sometimes pin his philosophy a bit much on what the state of science happened to be in his time. And of course, he was writing prior to quantum theory and general relativity, at least at the beginning of his career. Later, he came to grips with relativity, but he sometimes is seen as a little behind the times on science. He sometimes is seen as too much of a spiritualist figure. He did eventually become more and more religious as his life went on. He considered converting to Catholicism. The main reason he didn't is that Bergson, as a French Jew, did not want to abandon his people at their moment of dire danger. In fact, Bergson died in 1941 after standing in a queue to have to register as a Jew in Paris after the Nazi conquest of Paris. And Bergson was, 81, 82 years old by then, so he was offered the chance to absent himself, but he refused to do that. He wanted to share the fate of his people, caught a cold or pneumonia and died. And the odd thing about his death is that people were shocked by his death because they assumed he was already dead. He had fallen into such silence for the final 2 decades of his life. There were some health problems, apparently. I believe he had a daughter who was deaf, although that was true earlier, that demanded much of his time. And so, yes, he did become completely out of fashion for quite some time. But I think you have to call him one of the handful of great philosophers of the 20th century.
Okay, but tell us why. Tell us why you think that.
All right. Well, the first thing, of course, is his wonderful sense of time as something continuous rather than discontinuous. Time is something not made up of instants, but time is something that flows, and of growth is something that flows. Now, of course, in my book, I come down hard on the one-sided embrace of this, but he is probably the most eloquent spokesperson of this we have ever seen in the history of philosophy. The way he describes beautifully the metaphor that our minds are like snowballs that roll and roll and roll and keep picking up new material and don't lose any. So the role of memory in objects, that they somehow acquire their whole history and hang on to it without losing it. And his idea of experience is a kind of holistic weave of different impressions that can only be analyzed after the fact into different individual discrete pieces. And for those who have read Proust, it's no wonder that they had a close personal tie, because this is how Proust writes, right? That Proust will have a 17-page sentence with maybe a few commas in it, where all of these different experiences are woven together. I didn't expect to like Proust, but I really did. So if anyone wants to take on...
You and me both, I had the same experience.
Oh, good.
I thought, I'm never going to like this. And then I was absolutely mesmerized by it.
This is really wonderful. It's a long project. It takes a commitment, but yes. So and simply the poetic skill with which he describes things. That's what the Nobel Prize Committee said, his beautiful manner of expressing these wonderful ideas.
Yeah.
So, yeah, these are some of the things I love about Bergson. He never really had a school. This is what he didn't really lead to any immediate heirs. French philosophy after Bergson's time took a very different direction. It took the German direction towards phenomenology, and then later structuralism and post-structuralism. And it wasn't until Deleuze, from the 60s through his death in 1995, that Bergson became central to French philosophy again. You're still going to find a lot of physicists who don't like him because he also had this famous debate with Einstein, which now Einstein is now regarded as the fairly clear winner of that. But it wasn't so at the time. There were quite a few physicists siding with Bergson even at the time. And there's a nice book by Jimena Canales, a Mexican author, about that debate. The Physicist and the Philosopher, I think is the title. Hope I'm not misremembering. It sheds a lot of light on that debate. I learned a lot from that book. So I think there are a lot of reasons to revive Bergson, and especially for a book like mine, which talks about the continuous and the discrete, you have to have a chapter on Bergson since he is the spokesperson par excellence of the continuous.
Yes.
And this led to a bit of a feud with Bertrand Russell, the other Nobel Prize winner in literature from philosophy, who Russell comes from the tradition of Hume that I mentioned, which is very strong in the English-speaking world, which Russell says somewhere that the police may attest to the criminal's existence as the same criminal from one moment to the next, but he's actually a series of closely related people. He's not the same criminal because hairs are falling off his head and he's moving 5 meters down the sidewalk. And so Russell actually likes the cinematic model of time, where time is made of these individual frames of time that are disconnected. And so we're not actually the same person, whereas Bergson loathed the cinematic model of time. He said it doesn't work that way. It's a continuum, as Aristotle thought. It flows. There's no definite number of instants of time from one moment to the next. Now, what's interesting is that the model of time that Russell and Hume embrace has religious roots in the history of Islam, believe it or not.
Interesting.
This comes from the kind of philosophy that's called occasionalism. It began around 150 years into the history of Islam. There was a famous religious thinker in Basra, southern Iraq, named al-Ash'ari, who began as a fairly liberal, there was a fairly liberal school of Islamic philosophers called the Mutazilites, who were very influenced by Greek philosophy at that early stage. There was a kind of conservative reaction against them, and this man al-Ash'ari was one of the conservatives reacting against them. And one of their doctrines was that every instant of time is disconnected from every other. And they thought strongly that God is not the only creator, as all monotheists believe. They thought that God is the only causal agent at all. So when fire burns cotton, actually it's God burning cotton. It just looks like the fire and cotton are next to each other. And it's God that's burning the cotton. And also, not only are individual objects causally disconnected, individual moments of time are disconnected. The universe is being annihilated and recreated every instant by God. And so there isn't any continuity. The universe is disappearing and being recreated by God over and over and over and over again. This was part of their theory. It led to a lot of problems. For instance, if God is the only causal agent, what if I take a knife and murder somebody? Did God actually murder the person? Yeah. This was one of the things that critics said, and this led to a big debate. Well, this was known in medieval Christian Europe, but it was too threatening to the notion of free will in medieval Christian philosophy, where obviously if you're going to punish someone by sending them to hell or reward them by sending them to heaven, you want them to be responsible for their actions. And there were some in Islam who said this as well, but Islam has always been more comfortable with the idea of the absolute will of God, which simply must be accepted. So it wasn't quite as troublesome to at least a large segment of Muslims in that time to think that maybe God is causally responsible for your actions, and yet God can still send you to hell. So ironically, this rather conservative Islamic philosophy of the 9th century wasn't picked up by medieval Christians. It was picked up by early modern European philosophers, people like René Descartes and Nicolas Malebranche, for a different reason, which is that with Descartes, you get the dualism between mind and body.
Yes, which haunts us still.
Exactly. And so the question is, how do mind and body affect each other? And for Descartes, they have to affect each other through the medium of gods, because they're totally separate substances. So I have to make the decision to raise my arm, and then God raises my arm. Now, what's interesting about that is Descartes did not need God for body-body interactions because Descartes thought of all bodies as one big body. And so God is not needed for nature. This allowed Descartes to build a secular philosophy of nature in a way that the Islamic occasionalists could not have done. So this paved the way for modern science. But this is where occasionalism comes back into the Western philosophy, is not through the religious Western philosophy, or not through the medieval ones, but through the modern European thinkers. People like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, also Berkeley, where God plays such a role in determining how things move. Now, there's one final ironic twist, which is that what's key to occasionalism is not that God is the medium of all causal interaction, I would say. The key to it is that any one kind of entity has a monopoly on causal interaction. So it could be God, as it was in medieval philosophy and early modern for the occasionalists, but it could also be the human minds. And that's what we get in philosophy today.
Yes.
So for David Hume and Immanuel Kant, who are still very much contemporary philosophers, despite being 3 centuries old, causality is a category of the human mind. We can't know for sure if cause and effect exist in the world. We just know that it seems that cause and effect happens to humans for Hume, or that for Kant, cause and effect is a structure built into the human mind so that we can't not perceive it, though it doesn't necessarily exist outside the mind. But that is really an upside-down form of Islamic occasionalism, as I see it.
Yeah, but I mean, what's interesting is you've brought us to the sort of the late 20th century rebranding of this debate, where you've got, well, what is the importance of the human mind? And on one side you've got physicists saying, well, the human mind is essential for quantum mechanics, that the observer has to be involved if quantum mechanics is going to happen, if the wave function is going to collapse. And then you've got people like Dan Dennett, who are coming from a completely different part of science. I mean, he's mostly concerned with neuroscience and biology, who wants to deny there is anything that you could call the mind. There's just brain states. And so it seems like the whole debate has relaunched using slightly different language. And of course, where it figures in your writing, where you sow your way carefully through these great sprawling debates, is that in some sense it's those who say the world is discontinuous, it's just made of separate bits, who, like Dennett, end up saying there's no such thing as consciousness. You think there is, but there isn't. There's just one brain state, and then there's another brain state. And it's odd that, as you said, God figured in this at some point, and then late 20th century, the role of God was taken over by consciousness in a weird way. Or have I misunderstood that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I'm also glad you bring up Dennett, because I'm on the opposite side of Dennett for most things. Daniel Dennett, the American philosopher who died last year.
Yeah, I never got on with him either.
Okay.
I just never did. We never saw eye to eye.
There always needs to be someone like Dennett on the intellectual scene, someone who thinks everything's completely explicable. There are no mysteries, and science is our guide for pretty much every problem that exists. Someone has to fill that role.
Yeah.
And Dennett has vanished, but there are others maybe who don't fill it as well as he does. But here are a couple of things I think Dennett gets wrong. One of them is, as you point out, he thinks a scientific explanation of everything is possible. There's really no mystery. And in a sense, there's no discontinuity between the different levels of reality. So here's how I would put it. There are really only 2 kinds of knowledge in the world. This is my theory, not Dennett's. If somebody asks you what something is, you can either tell them what it's made of or tell them what it does. I talk about this in the book.
Yeah,
it's lovely. That's one of my favorite parts of the book.
I'm glad you like it. So for instance, let's say you met someone who somehow didn't know what water is. Well, you could tell them it's H2O. It's made of 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. Or you could tell them it quenches animal thirst and puts out fires. And you could tell them a lot of other things too, but really, those answers involve reducing the water in one of two directions. You reduce it downward to its pieces, you reduce it upward to its effects. And I call those undermining and overmining. Those are my technical terms. Well, the problem is, and there's nothing wrong with undermining and overmining, because all human knowledge comes from those 2 exercises, right? We need to know what water is made of chemically. We need to know what water does practically. However, that doesn't tell us everything about the water, because on the one hand, the water can't just be undermined to H2O because it has what we call emergent properties. H and O are both fuel for fire. H2O puts out fire. So water does things that its parts can't do. And so it emerges.
Yeah.
It also does, it submerges, as I call it, in the sense that water has many other potential effects that we don't know about yet, perhaps. Maybe not too many. We know water pretty well after all these years, but water is something in between those two extremes. Water is not reducible to its knowledge. A practical example will help. One instance that Dennett gives that I enjoy but I hate, that I often talk about, he's making fun of wine tasters in a passage in one of his articles. And he talks about a flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina. And Dennett is just mocking this ruthlessly and saying, what is that? That's nonsense. Real wine tasting is pour a glass of wine into a machine and it analyzes the chemical formula. That's all you really need to know. The rest is just poetic garbage. Okay, so Dennett's a literalist. Dennett thinks that if you simply explain what a thing is made of, that's all you need to know. But I think you lose a lot when you sacrifice the so-called mere poetry of the wine taster, because you can't literalize everything in the world. And Dennett should know this because this is true even in mathematics. For instance, it is literally true that you cannot literalize the three-dimensional globe of the Earth into a two-dimensional map, right? It's mathematically impossible to have an accurate map of London, let alone of Russia, because you cannot flatten a three-dimensional surface onto a two-dimensional surface. There's distortion involved of either the size or the shape. This is a mathematical fact. Well, something similar happens with language. You see this in metaphor, for instance. When Homer refers to the wine dark sea, that's the Mediterranean in the Odyssey, he says, Odysseus sails over the wine dark sea. You can't explain that metaphor as saying, basically, Homer's saying that the Mediterranean is the same color as certain bottles of wine. First of all, that's probably not true. There probably isn't any wine that's the same exact color. And the point is, that's not what the metaphor is doing. The metaphor is using that color as a pretext to insinuate other similarities like danger and oblivion and mystery that belong to both the wine and the sea. That's what the metaphor is really doing. So the point being that if you try to literalize everything, you are going to distort reality.
Yeah.
And at least in some of its aspects, the scientific understanding of the world is an attempt to literalize the world by turning it into accurate equations and prose descriptions, which inevitably are going to distort or oversimplify some aspects of reality and going to leave something out. And so Dennett's entire project is based on this idea that you can translate the world into a more technical scientific meta-language without losing anything. In terms of consciousness, he says, he's got a book called Consciousness Explained, as you know, and he thinks it's easy to explain because all you have to do is talk about the neurological patterns and the human behavior to which they lead, and that's consciousness.
Yeah.
He's very resistant to the idea that there's something special in between those two called conscious experience. And that's what David Chalmers, a rival of Dennett, calls the hard problem. The fact that even if you can explain the neurology and the outward behavior of a conscious agent, that doesn't explain anything about what it's like to actually be a human or a bat or some other living creature. Now, here's where I part company with one large strain of the anti-scientistic discourse, which is that a lot of people these days are seeing mind as the one special thing that can't be reduced in that way, right? That mind is somehow unique. Mind, we can explain everything else using science, but we can't explain minds.
Yeah.
I don't think you can explain everything about objects using scientific discourse, because I think any object is both emergent beyond its pieces and submergent beneath its effects. And so for me, it's a wider problem that fire and cotton also cannot be explained in that way. And so you've got a lot of people, such as Chalmers to some extent, but also Galen Strawson in the UK, and now Philip Goff, a younger panpsychist philosopher in the UK, who want to claim that everything must have a mind, right? This is the only way to get over certain philosophical problems. I don't think everything needs to have a mind. Yeah, right, panpsychist theory. I'm not a panpsychist. I'm sympathetic to panpsychism because I think it helps break down the tired dualisms we've had for 400 years. But I think it's overshooting the mark, because I don't think you need mind to escape the modern dualisms. Because I think there's already a problem with saying that a ball of cotton is nothing more than its smaller pieces or its uses. because it emerges beyond its molecules, but it also submerges beneath its uses. So objects themselves are already somewhat mysterious, even if they have no feelings at all. And so I'm worried about the idea that you need panpsychism to escape those issues.
I mean, for you, am I right in thinking that you're sort of exploring the same territory as those who say, well, objects, their nature is in their interaction with other objects, and therefore even the objects themselves don't know all of their qualities because they might interact with something they've never interacted with before.
That is certainly true. On the other hand, I have a certain distance from the people who determine objects in terms of relations. Alfred North Whitehead is a great example of that, as is my late friend Bruno Latour, the French philosopher who was very influenced by Whitehead.
Or Carlo Rovelli today.
Rovelli, yes, right. The idea that relationality is the nature of things. On this point, I side more with Aristotle. Aristotle had to face this claim in his own lifetime in a group of philosophers called the Megarians from Megara near Athens, who claimed that something is only what it's doing right now. So they were talking about a house builder. A house builder is only a house builder if he's building a house in this very moment.
Aye.
That was their theory. Aristotle's objection to that was, what about a master house builder who's sleeping? If he's not a house builder when he's asleep, then how does he regain the art of house building when he wakes up? So the house building must be present somewhere, even when he's not house building. And this led Aristotle to his famous concept, potentiality, that we still use today. And for people like Whitehead and Latour, potentiality is a somewhat superstitious concept, that we should instead be talking only about what a thing is actually doing. And for them, that means the actions. The American pragmatist philosophers were also somewhat like this, that a thing is only what it's doing. And for me, the thing is always a surplus beyond what it's doing right now.
Yes.
Right? That it cannot be analyzed entirely in terms of what it's doing. And it's kind of mysterious where that surplus is stored. But that doesn't mean it's mystical. It just means we have a hard time finding the right language to talk about it. And sometimes poetic language is the best we have. A great deal of human language is indirect.
A lot of science,
for instance,
too. I mean, science uses metaphors all the time.
Absolutely. You're right. Bohr's model of the atom was referring to the solar system, right? The planetary model, solar system. But also, if you think about jokes are automatically ruined as soon as you explain them. They can't become literal. Right? Best way to annoy someone who just told a joke is to explain the joke and how it worked.
Yes. Yeah.
Or threats.
Yes. But I mean, I can't sort of end this debate until we touch on one of the. You say it in the middle of the book, but it's such a massive point, and it sort of reverberates later in the book. But also, once you've said it, you sort of look back at the beginning of the book and think, oh, I see. Okay, so it slightly changes your reading at the beginning of the book, or it does for me. I think it's about, I don't know, about page 148. You're talking about objectivity and saying, look, we've got to get away from this notion that there's the objective world, which is everything that's made of stuff, and then there's the human mind, which is a completely separate thing, and objectivity is where we stand outside the reality and look at it from a distance. And you don't like that. I mean, you very much, with your overmining and undermining, we're in the midst of the world rather than being able to stand outside it. But you then talk about what you call retroactivity, which is a fascinating idea. And you say, look, the mind is actually a causal force in constructing nature. And it's related to this idea, I suppose, of when objects interact, they help bring out what the object is.
Yes.
But by actually making that strong statement, which I find interesting, and it seems like there are other people tiptoeing into this area as well, the panpsychists, or even Slavoj Žižek, although while you neatly so, he's more like a man with a bag of hand grenades. I hope you'll forgive me for saying that. But I'm interested in the way that you just come out and say, look, the mind is a causal force. That's a tremendously bold thing to say, isn't it?
Yes, although to me it feels quite natural.
Yeah, well, that feels natural to me, but that doesn't mean that Dennett wouldn't shout at both of us if he was still here.
Right. There are several different strands I guess I could pick up here. One of them, I don't remember how much I got into it in this book, but I've been increasingly interested in the difference between truth and justification. Ever since Plato, really, philosophers have talked about knowledge as justified true belief. Now, the reason they want to define it that way, they don't think true belief is enough to count as knowledge because you could just get lucky and get the truth by luck. So there's a Platonic dialogue where they mention, what if somebody asks you which way is the road to Larissa in northern Greece, and one person might know it because they've grown up there and they know exactly the road system perfectly. Another person might just simply guess and get right, and we wouldn't want to call that knowledge. And so they've added this qualifying word justified to true in order to characterize what knowledge is. You have to have the truth, but you also have to have reasons for knowing it's the truth.
Yeah.
And what interests me is that I think in the end, justification and truth are opposites. They don't work well together. The reason for that is, if you think of science as working primarily by justification, scientists often have hunches about things or believe things that they can't prove to be true. And then they're not going to bring those up in a scientific discourse. They're going to bring up what they can justify with evidence. And so you have, for instance, you may have deeply religious physicists who don't think they can really prove their religious views, and so they simply don't bring it up, or they specify it as simply a gut feeling that religion is true. But they have to stick, as professional scientists, with what is justifiable, what is the current set of evidence. There are a couple of problems with that. One of them is that justification changes all the time. Right. And so if you were to hold yourself to today's scientific evidence, you're definitely going to be believing in certain untruths. Just look at the fact that quantum theory and general relativity are incompatible. There's going to have to be some major change in our conception of reality as a result of that at some point, which means our current conception of reality is untrue. And people try to get out of that by saying, no, we have a partial truth, but we're going to gradually unveil more of the truth. For various reasons, I don't think that's possible. I agree with Thomas Kuhn, for instance, that Einstein is not simply an expansion of Newton's theory. Einstein's theory contradicts Newton's on certain points.
Absolutely, yes.
And so you'd have to say Newton, although he was the dominant scientist of the world for 2 centuries and more, was wrong about nature. Obviously, he wasn't completely wrong about everything, but his basic conception was wrong. He thought mass was conserved. Well, mass can be converted into energy. Newton thought gravity happens at infinite speed. It doesn't. It happens at the speed of light. Newton never suspected that mass curves space and time, and so forth. So eventually, Einstein's going to be just as wrong. And so in a way, this commitment to scientific truth is more about committing ourselves to the current state of evidence. And the future form of physics might go off in a completely different direction from what we think right now. A lot of times, theories that we abandon as being primitive or superstitious come back in some way in the future. In some form. And so that's one thing about justification being different from truth. The other side of it is that truth sometimes doesn't need justification or is opposed to it. And my favorite example here is the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, who in some ways was the forerunner of the existentialists in the early 1800s. And Kierkegaard lived in the time when Hegel's philosophical system was dominating the intellectual world. And Kierkegaard's point, to oversimplify a bit, was simply that you're never going to live long enough to be able to prove to yourself whether Hegel's right or not. Ultimately, you have a short life. You have to decide, are you going to be a Christian or not?
Yeah.
And that's an important decision. And Kierkegaard decided to become a Christian. You could also be an atheist existentialist like Sartre and simply decide, you make the decision that you're radically free, even if you can't prove it. And so that ultimately is what truth means, I think, is the thing that you live your life by that seems to you utterly convincing, even if you turn out to be wrong or change your mind at some later date. So there's this opposition between truth and justification. We forget that, in a sense, truth shapes our sense of reality as much as justification does, that we often make decisions that are not connected to evidence, but can be connected to arbitrary personal factors or can be connected to intuitions and hunches. And this is one sense in which I think the mind has a retroactive effect on the world. You simply have to decide, And so Kuhn talks about how the change to a different scientific paradigm is somewhat like a religious conversion, and he was crucified for that, pardon the metaphor. But there is something to that someone seizes on a new scientific theory at a certain point, even if they're outrunning the evidence that's available.
Yes.
So Leo Szilard, he was the first who thought that atomic fission could generate power and even bombs. And even as great a scientist as Ernest Rutherford called this moonshine at the time. But Szilard had a faith in this, a kind of commitment that he made mentally to the idea that this could happen. And of course, he was right, and it changed the world. We have atomic power and atomic weapons now.
Yeah.
And I'd like to go around sometime and do a survey of all the world's leading scientists and get them to admit, what do you have a hunch is true that flies in the face of all the evidence?
Yeah.
Because every one of them has something like that, I'm sure.
Yeah, and you know, the way that we constitute the world on the basis that we say you and I and Ian are responsible for our acts. So if one of us breaks the law or does something reprehensible,
Yes.
we construct the world. The way the world actually operates is based on that assumption, even if lots of scientists, included, would say, well, no, you're not. It's all predetermined. So the way the world actually runs, and the fact that people go to prison or in some countries get executed, that is the way the world runs. And it's because we think that's how it should run. So we are constituting the world in that way. And to get around that, you have to go through all kinds of weird gyrations to pretend that that's not the case.
It's also the case that human created things have as much reality as naturally created things, and the human created things can surprise us. So humans created human society, but that doesn't mean we can always predict how human society will react to certain policies. It's a very complex system. Any parent knows that the fact of creating a child doesn't mean that you can predict and control the child. So I'm against this separation that you have often in important thinkers, even between nature and culture, because Vico, Giambattista Vico, the great Italian thinker who I admire very much in the 18th century, said that since humans created human customs and human laws, we can understand them in a way that we can't understand nature. But I think that's completely untrue for the reason I just mentioned. Laws and customs and philosophies have ramifications that humans could never predict or even understand.
And they have a power over us that is beyond our ability to say, well, we created this.
Exactly. That's right. And often it's more go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's one of the things about your book is it's not a neat book in the sense that you say, right, this is what I'm going to prove. These are my steps. Here you go, 1, 2, 3, and now I proved it. It's more a redrawing of a familiar territory. So going out into this territory, which we all think we know, but as you're going through the book, sort of saying, well, I know that's what we think it looks like, but now we're in it. Can we see that actually it's a very different way of looking at this place, which you thought you were familiar with? So it's a book that you have to sort of go with. And accept that it's not exactly sawing off the branch you're sitting on. It's more that it's repainting the environment you thought you were in. So you go for a walk somewhere in the woods, and by the time you finish taking us there, it's not the woods at all. It's something completely different.
I think that's a fair description. I was trying to identify one problem that crops up in a number of completely different areas, and then trying to deepen our sense of the implications of that problem. I think a lot of people were. I'm sorry.
Go on, Graham.
I think a lot of people will be surprised by the breadth of topics that are there, because I also talk about Genghis Khan and
yeah, absolutely.
Well, we haven't even touched on architecture, which was
that's right, architecture.
Yeah, there was a whole section on that. I mean, I found the book fascinating. It was it's probably the best thing I could sort of say about a book is it was so hard to put down. Whereas I was reading a couple of pages and then I'd have to put it down, and then sort of like imagine everything that's been discussed in it. It's almost as if you're taking us along this path, and then I'd sort of, about 10 minutes later, I'd pick the book back up, and then I'd read the last couple of lines, and then read the next paragraph. And it was kind of like the next paragraph was the vision that I'd picked in my head. It was some kind of witchery going on.
That's funny. Yeah, that's what happens when I reread my own books, which I don't do often. Is I'll be reading a sentence and think of an objection, but
Yeah.
somebody could say this, and then I answer it in the next sentence.
So I just sort of thought it was full of energy, and there was a great interaction between. It was like a conversation, and I haven't joined in this conversation much, but it's been fascinating listening to you both.
I mean, the last thing I just wanted to say is that I get the feeling that the nature of the book suggests to me that we are at a point in our, not just our philosophy, but in the way we're trying to understand our own science and the way we're trying to use it as a metaphor, series of metaphors to understand how history changes, how politics changes. Reading your book and a few others that are being published at the moment, I just get this sense that people like yourself, Graham, either you have a clear notion or you have a gut feeling that we're at a moment where, I suppose in Thomas Kuhn's terms, where all the parts of our understanding might rearrange, a bit like when you turn a kaleidoscope. It's all the same parts, but as you turn it, they all form a rather different pattern. And I got that feeling from reading your book, that the breadth of what you're questioning and saying, could the changes here be in some deep way related to the changes over there, suggested to me that there was this feeling of a moment where a lot of our understanding might change. Have I just imagined that, Graham, or does that sound?
No, I think that's true. I think what's happening is we are exiting modernity, and nobody really knows what's coming next. And this is a very fraught time for all of us. It's very confusing. The guideposts are dissolving. We've had 400 years of being able to largely extrapolate from this idea that science is going to free us from superstition, and we're gradually going to enlighten everyone. Things are gradually going to improve. Obviously, the 20th century gave a shock to that with the two world wars and concentration camps and things. But people have been using the word postmodern since the 1960s, but nothing new beyond modernity has necessarily happened during that period. Postmodernity has just been a confusing period of modernity. But I think what's happening now is the modern guidelines for how things should be conducted in various fields are proving to be inadequate. Let me give you an example from politics, because I get asked about political theory a lot. The political landscape of today is still very much governed by the opposition between left and right, which goes back to the French Revolution and the two sides of the assembly. And you can meet someone and within a few minutes get a pretty good sense of how far left or right they are. And sometimes it's a little tricky because certain people have odd combinations of views. But if you look historically at the left and right political theorists, you're going to find that it boils down to two different theories of human nature. So the left tends to think of humans as being naturally good or at least improvable, and that if things are going wrong, it's because there's oppression or because there's a social class that is taking everything for itself or because society is corrupting us. So this is Marx, Rousseau, or more moderate people like Locke. Then on the right, you have the idea that humans are either evil or at least not improvable. Human nature has always been the same, and therefore we must be prudent and cautious, and force is often needed. And international relations is a dangerous zone, and we should simply avoid the worst instead of trying for the best. And here you have Machiavelli and Hobbes and Schmitt and these hardcore thinkers. Then recently you had a book by David Graeber and David Wengrow, both anarchists, called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, where they challenged this opposition. And I was thinking, all right, this is great. This is what I want to do too. But then they simply offered a new theory of human nature. They said humans aren't naturally good or evil. Humans are naturally experimental. And their goal is, they're part of this camp of the left that is tired of capitalism being considered the only alternative. And so they want to experiment with anthropologically what other societies have experimented with. But what they end up with is just another theory of human nature. And I think what's really the case is that politics is not primarily about human nature. there are all kinds of non-human entities involved in political reality. And I think I get more resistance from the left than from the right when I say this, even though I feel closer to the left than the right. And I think it's because the left wants to think of politics as a matter primarily of imagination. We can just imagine a better world and get to it together.
Yeah.
Whereas I think often the right is a little more open to the fact that there are some ideas, or sorry, some realities that aren't just easy to wish away, and we have to build our politics on top of that. And I think there's something to that. One area where this has often been seen is the case of geography. So the fact that England is on an island has given England a very different foreign policy from Germany or France, which have very dangerous land armies very nearby. And so they've had to play a little more realpolitik than England. England has always been able to afford a more liberal policy, more of an aloof policy, wait to see which continental power is becoming too strong and then support the other one instead to keep a balance. And in a sense, the United States has inherited this from England simply because Canada and Mexico have never been threatening neighbors. And so we are effectively an island as well, geopolitically. So we also become a naval power. If we were Germany or Russia, we wouldn't have that luxury. We would have to be a large land power with more of an authoritarian history. And so geography obviously plays a role in that sense, that the England for sure and the US also are somewhat destined to be naval powers. And there are certain features that follow from being naval powers. And some of them are domestic, such as a greater liberalism, more sharing of information with the public, things like this. But now we're seeing an even more important example, which is climate change. Whether or not humans seem to have created a large part of it, and yet we cannot control it. We've let the genie out of the bottle, but we don't control the genie anymore. And so political theory, in large part, now has to be based on CO2 and methane and tree planting and sea level rise. These kinds of things have to be part of our politics. Now, what's ironic is that one of the first institutions to see this, at least in the United States, was the military, because the military is professionally obliged to face reality, or they're going to lose very badly. And so it was the US Navy that saw that sea level rise is going to be a big problem for our bases worldwide. And there's a tendency on the left to see the military as just a bunch of idiots who simply want to kill people and dominate people. But in fact, I often find military theorists to be very enlightening in dealing with aspects of reality that economists or historians aren't always necessarily as alert to. So I think it's going to be a slow process, for example, to realign our politics and see that, yes, we can have a good kind of politics, but it isn't necessarily going to be based on the idea that we are liberating everyone from oppression, because oppression may not be the primary political category that we thought it was in modernity on the left.
Yes.
Oppression happens, obviously. People are treated unfairly, and we need to address that. But is that really going to be the center of a good politics going forward? I have my doubts.
Yes.
I think it's going to be more about coming to terms with non-human entities and how they shape the political space. For instance, the United States, you could make the case that our whole political culture was destroyed by Facebook, because Facebook obviously has a vested interest in keeping people involved and staying on Facebook as long as possible. One way to do that is to get people angry or to get people feeling self-righteous. And the way to do that is to feed people what they want to hear. And so on Facebook knows I'm left liberal, and so Facebook feeds me left liberal news stories, things that are going to make me angry, like corporation is damaging the environment somehow. What an outrage. They know I'm going to get angry about this and share it and stay on Facebook. A right-winger in America might get some article about black crime, black crime committed in white suburbs. That's going to make a white right-winger angry. And they know how to do this. They know how to feed our prejudices. What's that? Sorry?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So I'm not in the same information universe as a Trump supporter. I don't want to be, but I no longer have anything to say to such people. And this is part of why Trump was elected twice. The fact that these people are seeing a different reality that to me is a fabrication, but to them it's a very real reality reinforced by Facebook. There's no public media space really like there was when I was young.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose we should draw this to a close, but I'd just like to sum up that, well, not sum up, but reading the book, I think if I was to say to someone, well, why should you read this book? For me, it's because it feels like the kind of book which when historians look back at this period and say, what was the intellectual feel of the times? What were people really grappling with? I think this would be one of the books that historians would say, you should read Harman's Waves and Stones, because it feels like it's honestly in the midst of this. It's admitting that, as you said before, just a few minutes ago, that our old ways of seeing things, our old assumption that we can just extrapolate from the past, that's no longer true, or we feel it might not be true. And it feels to me, when reading your book, that it's a book which is honestly saying, yeah, that's the situation we're in, and we need to look around ourselves and try to reevaluate the nature of the reality around us, from the quantum up to the political, as honestly as we can. And by honestly, I mean not just lazily reaching for the assumptions that our grandfathers and grandmothers gave us. And that's what I found interesting about the book, is that it has that feel about it. And for me, that's why I would say to someone, that would be the reason to read it, is that you're experiencing that, a thinker in that moment. I hope you feel that's a fair summary of the book.
That's very kind of you. I do think we are in such a moment. I, for one, have never felt more confused during my lifespan about what's going on. I really have no idea what the world will look like 10 years from now. And I think this is the first time I would say that in my lifespan so far.
Yeah, if somebody spent an hour a day reading your book and didn't spend an hour a day on Facebook, the world might be a slightly better place.
I hope so. I hope
Graham,
so.
it's been lovely listening to you both. Fascinating. The book comes out on the 6th of November in the UK. I don't know if it's already out in the US.
I have advanced copies, but I think the publication date's the same in the US, at least as
so
far as I know.
6th of November. So I would hope that people can log on to bookshop.org or worldofbooks.com and go and order their copy now.
Graham, it's been great. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again, because there's so much more.
I might get a question in.
Sorry, Ian. Sorry, you knew I was going to dominate this, because I'm just so fascinated by all the things that Graham brought up.
Yeah, no, I totally enjoyed listening. I didn't think I was going to add an awful lot. Well, I could if we had another hour. But yeah.
Oh, listen, Graham, thank you very much for coming to talk to us. It's been great. And
I've loved it.
Waves and Stones on the Ultimate Nature of Reality by Graham Harman, from Allen Lane in the UK. It's a book of the moment, of this moment we're all living through, and it is well worth immersing yourself in. So, Graham, thank you.
Welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks again for taking the time to listen.
If you enjoyed that, you can head over to Substack or YouTube.
Maybe leave a review. But also tell us what you think.
What you agreed with, what you disagreed with.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much.